The cold was killing her, and Helena Rivers knew that if she stayed outside much longer, she would freeze to death on her own family's front porch. She pounded against the heavy wooden door with fists that had already lost most of their feeling, her breath coming out in desperate white clouds that vanished into the January darkness of 1884. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight in Montrose, Colorado, transforming the high desert landscape into something beautiful and deadly. And Helena had made the mistake of stepping outside to check on the horses without her coat. When she tried to return, she found the door locked from the inside, and no amount of screaming or begging could convince her stepmother to let her back in. "Please," Helena cried, her voice cracking with cold and desperation. "Sarah, I am freezing out here. Just let me in." But there was no response from inside the house, only the mocking whistle of wind through the eaves and the soft crunch of accumulating snow. Helena had known her stepmother disliked her, had known it from the moment her father remarried 2 years ago, but she never imagined the woman would be capable of something like this. Her father was away on business in Denver, gone for another week at least, and Sarah had apparently decided this was the perfect opportunity to be rid of her 19-year-old stepdaughter once and for all. Helena's teeth chattered so violently she bit her tongue, tasting blood. Her fingers were white and stiff, her thin cotton dress soaked through from the snow. She could not feel her toes anymore. The main street of Montrose was empty, everyone sensible huddled around their fires, and the Rivers house sat on the far edge of town where no one would hear her cries for help. Despair washed over her as she sank down against the door, hugging her knees to her chest in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. She was going to die here, she realized, frozen on her own doorstep like some kind of terrible joke. That was when she heard the sound of hoofbeats muffled by snow, and she looked up through vision that was starting to blur to see a figure on horseback emerging from the white curtain of the storm. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. For a moment, Helena thought she might be hallucinating, that her mind was playing tricks on her as it began to shut down, but then the rider was dismounting and running toward her, his boots crunching through the drifts. "Jesus Christ," the man said, and his voice was deep and rough with alarm. "Madam, how long have you been out here?" He dropped to his knees beside her, and Helena could see concerned gray eyes beneath the brim of his hat, a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of stubble. She tried to answer, but her jaw would not work properly, the words coming out as nothing more than a mumbled nonsense. The man did not waste time asking more questions. He stood up and tried the door handle, swearing when he found it locked. Then he stepped back, raised his boot and kicked hard at the lock. The door shuddered but held. He kicked again, throwing his full weight behind it, and this time the wood around the lock splintered with a sharp crack. One more kick, and the door burst inward, swinging open to reveal the warm interior of the house and Sarah Rivers standing in the hallway with wide, shocked eyes. "What do you think you are doing?" Sarah demanded, her face flushing with anger. "This is private property, and I will have you arrested for breaking into my home." "Your home?" The cowboy's voice was cold as the storm outside. "Then I guess you were planning to answer your door and let this woman inside before she froze to death. Is that right?" He did not wait for an answer, instead turning back to where Helena sat slumped against the doorframe. He scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing, and Helena felt the blessed warmth of his body even through his thick coat. She tried to say thank you, but the words still would not come. The cowboy carried her inside, shouldering past Sarah, who was sputtering protests and threats. He looked around the entryway, then headed toward the sitting room where Helena could see the glow of the fireplace. He set her down carefully on the sofa closest to the fire, then began stripping off his own coat. "Get some blankets," he ordered Sarah, who had followed them into the room. "And warm water, not hot. She needs to warm up gradually or it could hurt her worse." "I will do no such thing," Sarah said, drawing herself up with indignation. "You have broken into my house and I am going to fetch the sheriff this instant." She turned to leave, but the cowboy moved fast, blocking her path to the door. "You locked her out in a blizzard," he said quietly, and there was something dangerous in his tone that made Sarah take a step back. "That is attempted murder in my book, and I am guessing the sheriff might see it the same way. Now you can get those blankets and help me save her life, or you can stand there and look guilty while I do it myself. Your choice, but make it quick." Something in his eyes must have convinced Sarah he was serious, because she turned without another word and hurried from the room. The cowboy knelt beside Helena, rubbing her hands gently between his own much larger ones. The friction was agonizing at first, pins and needles shooting through her fingers, and she whimpered despite herself. "I know it hurts," he said, his voice much gentler now, "but that is a good sign. Means you are not too far gone. Can you tell me your name?" Helena's jaw was still trembling, but she managed to force out the words this time. Helena," she whispered. "Helena Rivers." "Helena," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am Cody James. I was passing through on my way to my ranch when I saw you on the porch. Can you move your toes?" Helena concentrated hard and managed to wiggle them, though she could not feel them yet. Cody nodded with approval. "Good. That is real good." Sarah returned with an armful of blankets and a pitcher of water that was probably lukewarm at best. Cody took them without thanking her and wrapped the blankets around Helena's shoulders, tucking them in carefully. Then he poured some of the water into a basin and had Helena put her feet into it. The sensation was excruciating, and tears streamed down her cheeks, but Cody stayed beside her the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. "Where is your father?" Cody asked, and Helena explained through chattering teeth that he was away on business. Cody's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Sarah, who was hovering in the doorway looking furious and afraid in equal measure. "I see. And you thought that gave you the right to lock his daughter out of the house?" Sarah's face went red, but she said nothing, apparently deciding that silence was her best defense. It took nearly an hour before Helena stopped shaking, before color began to return to her fingers and face. Cody never left her side, monitoring her carefully and adjusting the blankets as needed. When she was finally able to speak without her teeth chattering, she looked up at him with gratitude that made her chest ache. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt completely inadequate for what he had done. "You saved my life." Cody shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, but Helena knew that was not true. Sarah certainly would not have, and most people would not have even been out in weather like this to find her in the first place. "How are you feeling now? Any numbness that is not going away?" Helena wiggled her fingers and toes experimentally and was relieved to find sensation returning to all of them, though they ached terribly. "I think I will be all right," she said. "Thanks to you." She looked toward the doorway where Sarah had disappeared, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "She has hated me since she married my father, but I never thought she would do something like this." Cody's expression darkened. "Your father needs to know what happened here," he said firmly. "A woman who would leave her stepdaughter to freeze to death is not someone who should be trusted." Helena knew he was right, but the thought of the confrontation that would follow made her stomach twist with anxiety. Her father had been so happy when he remarried, so relieved to have someone to help run the household after Helena's mother died. Would he even believe her if she told him what Sarah had done? As if reading her thoughts, Cody added, "I will back up your story. I saw you on that porch, saw the door locked from the inside. Your father would be a fool not to believe the evidence of his own eyes." There was a certainty in his voice that made Helena feel safer than she had in months. This stranger, this cowboy who had appeared out of the storm like some kind of avenging angel, was offering to stand up for her against her own family. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Cody looked surprised by the question, his gray eyes searching her face. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because no one deserves to be treated the way you were treated tonight." There was something in his gaze that made Helena's heart skip a beat, a warmth and sincerity that she had not seen in a man's eyes since her father started courting Sarah. She realized suddenly that Cody James was quite handsome beneath the trail dust and stubble, with strong features and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The blizzard continued to rage outside, and after another hour it became clear that Cody was not going to be able to leave tonight. The snow was falling so thick and fast that visibility was nearly zero, and the temperature had dropped to the point where traveling would be suicide. Sarah was clearly unhappy about having him in the house, but she did not dare object after what had happened. She retreated to her room upstairs and locked the door, leaving Helena and Cody alone in the sitting room. "You should try to sleep," Cody said, feeding another log into the fire. "Your body needs rest to recover." But Helena shook her head, not ready to let him out of her sight. "I am not tired," she lied, though exhaustion was pulling at her limbs. "Tell me about your ranch. You said you were heading there." Cody settled back in the chair across from her, stretching his long legs out toward the fire. "It is not much yet," he admitted. "Just a small spread about 10 miles north of here that I bought last year with my savings from working cattle drives. Got 100 head of cattle and a cabin that needs a lot of work, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, and Helena found herself smiling despite everything that had happened. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Being able to build something of your own." Cody nodded, his eyes distant as he stared into the flames. "That is the dream," he said. "Spent 10 years working for other men, following their orders and sleeping under the stars. Finally saved up enough to have my own place, make my own decisions. It is hard work, but it is worth it." He glanced at her, and there was something almost shy in his expression. "Do you like it here in Montrose?" Helena considered the question carefully. Before her father remarried, she had loved living here, loved the way the valley nestled between the mountains, loved the community of people who looked out for each other. But these past 2 years with Sarah had been miserable, every day filled with small cruelties and cutting remarks. Her father was gone so often on business that he did not see how his wife treated his daughter, or perhaps he simply did not want to see. "I used to," she said finally, "but things have been difficult since my father remarried. Tonight was just the worst of many incidents." She did not elaborate, did not want to burden this kind stranger with all the petty humiliations Sarah had heaped upon her, but Cody seemed to understand anyway. "If your father does not believe you about what happened tonight, you should leave," he said bluntly. "A man who would choose a new wife over his own daughter's safety is not worth staying for." The words were harsh, but Helena could not argue with them. She had been thinking the same thing herself, lying awake at night and wondering if she should try to find work somewhere else, start a new life away from Sarah's cruelty. But jobs for women were scarce, and the thought of leaving her father had always stopped her. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily despite having just met. Cody told her about growing up on a small farm in Kansas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 16 and heading west to make his own way. Helena told him about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and about how she had taught Helena to read and write and love learning. She found herself laughing at Cody's stories about life on the cattle drives, the eccentric characters he had met, and the close calls with stampedes and river crossings. He was a natural storyteller, his words painting vivid pictures, and Helena realized she felt more comfortable with him after a few hours than she had felt with anyone in years. The storm finally began to break around dawn, the snow tapering off to occasional flurries. Cody stood and looked out the window at the transformed landscape, everything buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. "I should be able to make it home now," he said, and Helena felt her heart sink at the thought of him leaving. He had stayed with her all night, keeping watch to make sure Sarah did not try anything else, and now he would ride out of her life as suddenly as he had entered it. But before she could say anything, Cody turned back to her with a serious expression. "I meant what I said about talking to your father. When does he get back from Denver?" "Another week," Helena said. "Maybe less if the weather clears." Cody nodded slowly, clearly thinking something through. "I will come back in a week," he said, "to make sure you are all right and to speak with your father about what happened. Would that be acceptable to you?" The relief that washed through Helena was so strong it made her dizzy. "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, that would be very acceptable." Something in Cody's expression softened and he smiled at her, a real genuine smile that made her stomach flutter. "Then I will see you in a week, Miss Rivers," he said formally, but his eyes held warmth that belied the formal words. He collected his coat and hat, and Helena walked him to the broken front door that would need repair. Cody paused on the threshold, looking back at her with concern. "Keep that fire going and stay warm, and if your stepmother tries anything like last night again, you get yourself to town immediately." "Promise me." "I promise," Helena said, and she meant it. She was not going to let Sarah put her life in danger again. Cody nodded, apparently satisfied, and then he was mounting his horse and riding away through the snow-covered street. Helena stood in the doorway until he disappeared from view, hugging her arms around herself against the cold. Something had changed in her during the long night, some fundamental shift in how she saw her life and her possibilities. Cody James had shown her that there were good men in the world, men who would do the right thing even for a stranger. And suddenly, the future did not seem quite so bleak. The next week was the longest of Helena's life. Sarah barely spoke to her, except to issue curt orders, and Helena could see the calculation in her stepmother's eyes as the woman tried to figure out how much trouble she was in. Helena spent most of her time in her room, reading and rereading the few books she owned and thinking about Cody. She replayed their conversation over and over in her mind, remembering the way his eyes had crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he had rubbed warmth back into her frozen hands, the certainty in his voice when he promised to return. Her father came home 8 days after the blizzard, his arrival announced by the sound of his wagon in the front yard. Helena's heart began to race as she realized the confrontation she had been dreading was finally here. She came downstairs to find her father embracing Sarah, who was already crying and spinning some story about how a drifter had broken into the house and threatened them both. Helena's stomach dropped as she heard the lies flowing from Sarah's mouth, but before she could interrupt, there was a knock at the front door. Helena opened it to find Cody standing on the porch, hat in hand and expression serious. He was clean-shaven now and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, a pressed shirt and vest that made him look almost like a different person from the trail-worn cowboy who had rescued her. But his eyes were the same, gray and steady and kind, and Helena felt her anxiety ease slightly at the sight of him. "Mr. James," she said, unable to keep the relief out of her voice. "Please come in." Cody stepped inside, and his presence seemed to fill the entryway. Helena's father had come out of the sitting room at the sound of the knock, and he looked at Cody with confusion and growing suspicion. "Who is this?" William Rivers demanded, and Sarah was at his shoulder immediately, her face pale. "This is the man I was telling you about," Sarah said quickly. "The one who broke our door." But Cody did not let her continue. "My name is Cody James," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I am here to tell you what really happened while you were away, Mr. Rivers. Your wife locked your daughter out in a blizzard and left her to freeze to death. I found Helena on your front porch, nearly dead from exposure, and I broke the lock to save her life." The words fell into the room like stones, and William Rivers went very still. "That is a lie," Sarah said shrilly. "He is lying, William. I would never do such a thing." But William was looking at Cody with sharp eyes, taking in the cowboy's honest face and steady demeanor. "Why would you lie about something like this?" William asked quietly, and Cody met his gaze without flinching. "I have no reason to lie, sir," he said. "I do not know you or your family. I am simply telling you what I saw with my own eyes. Your daughter was locked out in the snow, blue with cold and close to death. Your wife refused to help her when I brought her inside. If I had not been passing by, Helena would be dead right now." William turned to look at his daughter, and Helena saw the question in his eyes. "It is true, father," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I went outside to check on the horses, and when I tried to come back in, Sarah had locked the door. I begged her to let me in, but she would not. If Mr. James had not found me, I would have frozen to death on our own porch." William's face went white, then red, and he turned to Sarah with an expression Helena had never seen before. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, then tried to force out a denial that even she must have known sounded hollow. "She is exaggerating," Sarah said weakly. "She was only outside for a few minutes, and I was just about to let her in when this man broke down our door." But William was not listening anymore. He looked at Cody again. "You saw her locked out?" he asked, and Cody nodded. "Yes, sir. She was so cold she could not speak, could not move properly. Another hour and she would have been gone." William closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were filled with a rage that made even Sarah step back. "Get out," he said to his wife, his voice shaking. "Pack your things and get out of my house. I want you gone by tomorrow morning." Sarah's face went from pale to ashen, and she reached for William's arm. "William, please," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "You cannot mean that. I am your wife." But William shook off her hand as if it burned him. "You tried to kill my daughter," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "What kind of monster does that? Get out of my sight before I do something I will regret." Sarah looked around wildly as if seeking help, but finding none she turned and fled up the stairs, her sobs echoing through the house. William stood frozen for a moment, then turned to Helena and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I am so sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I should have seen what she was doing to you. I should have protected you better." Helena clung to her father, tears spilling down her own cheeks, and felt years of tension and fear finally begin to drain away. When William finally released her, he turned to Cody and extended his hand. "I owe you my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There is nothing I can do or say that would be enough to thank you, but please know that you will always be welcome in this house." Cody shook his hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I just did what anyone would have done, sir," he said, but William shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "Most men would have ridden past in weather like that. You stopped, you helped, and you came back to make sure justice was done. That speaks to your character, Mr. James." He paused, seeming to consider something, then added, "I understand you have a ranch north of town. If you ever need anything, supplies or help or just a hot meal, you come to us. It is the least we can do." Over the following weeks, Cody took William up on his offer more often than Helena had dared to hope. He would ride into town for supplies and stop by to check on Helena, staying for dinner and conversation that stretched long into the evening. Sarah had left as ordered, returning to her family in Kansas with a divorce settlement that ensured she would not speak ill of the Rivers family. Her departure had lifted a weight from the household that Helena had not fully realized she was carrying, and she found herself smiling and laughing again in a way she had not done in years. As spring began to melt the snow and green shoots pushed through the frozen ground, Helena realized she was falling in love with Cody James. It happened gradually, and then all at once, in the way he listened when she talked about her dreams of someday teaching like her mother had, in the way he brought her small gifts from his ranch like the first wildflowers or an interesting rock he had found. She loved the way his face lit up when he talked about his plans for the ranch, the way he treated her father with respect but never deference, the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen in a way no one ever had before. One evening in late March, Cody asked if Helena would like to see his ranch, and she agreed immediately despite her father's raised eyebrows. They rode out together in the cool morning air, Helena sitting side saddle on a gentle mare that Cody had borrowed from a friend in town. The ranch was beautiful in a stark, wild way, with the cabin sitting in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills that were just beginning to turn green. The cabin itself was rough but sturdy, built of logs that Cody had cut himself, and Helena could see the care he had taken with every detail. "It is not much," Cody said, watching her face anxiously, "but it has good bones. With some work it could be a real home." Helena turned to him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "You should be proud of what you have built here." Something in Cody's expression shifted, and he reached out to take her hand. "Helena," he said, and her name on his lips sent shivers down her spine. "I know we have not known each other long, but these past months have been the happiest of my life. Every day I find myself thinking of excuses to ride into town just so I can see you. When I imagine the future, the only thing that makes sense is if you are in it." Helena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was saying. Cody squeezed her hand gently, his gray eyes searching her face. "I do not have much to offer you yet. Just this ranch and a lot of hard work and a heart that is completely yours if you want it. But Helena Rivers, would you consider becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Helena's eyes, but they were tears of joy, and she was nodding before he even finished speaking. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Cody, I will marry you. I love you." The smile that broke across Cody's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. And then he was pulling her close and kissing her with a tenderness that made her forget everything else in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Cody rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this," he promised, and Helena believed him with every fiber of her being. They were married in May of 1884 in a simple ceremony at the church in Montrose, with Helena's father beaming with pride as he walked her down the aisle. The whole town turned out to celebrate, touched by the romantic story of the cowboy who had saved the woman he would eventually marry. Helena wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Cody had picked that morning from the hills around his ranch. Life on the ranch was harder than Helena had imagined, but more fulfilling than she had ever dreamed. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to tend chickens and collect eggs, to help Cody with the endless tasks required to keep a working ranch running. Her hands became calloused, and her skin tanned from hours spent outdoors, but she had never been happier. Cody was everything she had hoped for in a husband, and more, attentive and affectionate and endlessly patient as she learned the rhythms of ranch life. They added on to the cabin over the first year, building a larger kitchen and a proper bedroom, and Cody built Helena a small writing desk by the window where she could sit and watch the valley while she wrote letters to her father. William visited often, clearly relieved to see his daughter so happy and thriving, and he and Cody developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. In the spring of 1885, Helena discovered she was pregnant. The joy on Cody's face when she told him was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The way he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests that she was not fragile. He became even more protective during her pregnancy, insisting she rest more and take on fewer chores, though Helena refused to let him coddle her too much. Their son was born in December of that year during another snowstorm, as if the weather wanted to remind them of how they had met. They named him Thomas William James, after Cody's father and Helena's, and the tiny red-faced baby became the center of their world. Watching Cody with their son made Helena fall in love with him all over again. He was a natural father, gentle and playful and endlessly patient with the infant. Even after long days working the ranch, Cody would come in and immediately reach for Thomas, walking him around the cabin and talking to him about the ranch as if the baby could understand every word. The years passed in a blur of work and love and laughter. Their ranch grew slowly but steadily, the herd increasing and their reputation for quality cattle spreading throughout the region. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Grace in 1888 and another son named Michael in 1891, and the cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family. Helena started a small school in town, teaching children 2 days a week, while Cody managed the ranch and the children, fulfilling her mother's dream and her own. On their 10th anniversary, Cody surprised Helena with a trip back to the spot where he had first found her, though the Rivers house had been sold after William decided to move to a smaller place in town. They stood on the street in front of it, Helena wrapped in Cody's arms, and marveled at how different their lives were from that terrible night. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had not ridden past that night?" Cody asked, his voice quiet. Helena shuddered and held him tighter. "I try not to," she admitted. "But sometimes I do, and it reminds me not to take a single moment of this life for granted. You saved me, Cody, in more ways than just breaking down that door." Cody kissed the top of her head. "You saved me too," he said. "I was just existing before I met you, working towards some vague idea of a future I could not quite picture. But you gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something real and lasting. Every good thing in my life can be traced back to that night." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching snow begin to fall again, soft and gentle this time instead of the punishing blizzard of their first meeting. As the years continued to pass, the ranch became one of the most successful in the region, and Cody and Helena became pillars of the Montrose community. Their children grew strong and healthy, Thomas showing an interest in ranching like his father, Grace developing her mother's love of books and teaching, and Michael displaying a talent for working with horses that made even the most experienced cowboys shake their heads in amazement. William Rivers lived to see all three of his grandchildren grow into young adults, passing away peacefully in his sleep in 1903 at the age of 72. Helena grieved deeply for her father, but she was comforted by the fact that his last years had been happy ones, filled with family and the knowledge that his daughter was thriving. He had never remarried after divorcing Sarah, telling Helena that one bad marriage had taught him to appreciate the good years he had with her mother and to be content with that. The 20th century brought changes to the West, the wild frontier slowly giving way to civilization with railroads and telegraphs and eventually automobiles. But the core of life on the ranch remained the same, built on hard work and family and the land itself. Cody's hair went gray at the temples and then all over, and lines deepened around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But to Helena, he was still the handsome cowboy who had appeared out of a blizzard to save her life. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1909 with a party that brought together half the county. And as Helena looked around at their grown children and wide circle of friends, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built together. That night, lying in bed with Cody's arm around her, she told him so. "I cannot imagine my life without you," she said, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "Sometimes I still cannot believe that you chose me." Cody captured her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I did not choose you," he said, his voice warm with affection. "I was chosen by fate or luck or divine providence to be in the right place at the right time. And then I was smart enough to recognize the best thing that ever happened to me and hold on tight." Helena smiled in the darkness, feeling loved and cherished in a way that still made her heart flutter after all these years. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Cody got older, having learned everything his father could teach him and adding innovations of his own. Grace married a teacher from Denver and opened a school for girls, carrying on her grandmother's legacy. Michael started a horse breeding program that became renowned throughout Colorado, his intuitive understanding of the animals leading to some of the finest stock in the region. In 1920, Cody and Helena became grandparents when Thomas and his wife had a son, and the cycle began again. Watching Cody with his grandson, seeing the same gentleness and patience he had shown with their own children, made Helena fall in love with him yet again. They were in their 50s now, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but the love between them had only deepened with time. They would sit on the porch of the ranch house in the evenings, expanded and improved so many times over the years that it bore little resemblance to the rough cabin Cody had built as a bachelor, and watch the sun set over the valley they had made their home. Helena would lean against Cody's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they would talk about their day or simply sit in comfortable silence, needing no words to communicate the contentment they felt. One evening in late winter, as snow fell gently outside, Cody turned to Helena with a thoughtful expression. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" he asked, "after I brought you inside?" Helena thought back across nearly 4 decades, surprised she could still recall that night with such clarity. "I said thank you," she replied, and Cody shook his head. "Before that, when you could barely speak and I asked if you could move your toes, do you remember what you did?" Helena frowned, struggling to recall those confused, painful moments. Then it came to her and she smiled. "I looked at you," she said slowly, "and I thought that if I was going to die, at least the last thing I saw was a kind face." Cody nodded, his own eyes growing misty. "I saw that look," he said quietly, "and I promised myself in that moment that I was going to save you, no matter what it took. I did not know then that you would save me right back, that you would become my whole world, but I am glad I made that promise. I am glad I kept it." Helena kissed him softly, tasting salt from tears she was not sure belonged to him or her or both of them. "So am I," she whispered. "So am I." As they grew older together, their love story became legendary in Montrose and the surrounding area. Young couples would ask them for advice on marriage, and Cody and Helena would share the wisdom they had learned over decades together. "Be honest with each other," they would say. "Work as a team. Never go to bed angry. Remember that love is both a feeling and a choice, and sometimes you have to choose it even when the feeling is hard to find. And always, always be grateful for the person beside you, because life is fragile and tomorrow is never guaranteed." They lived to see the roaring 20s, watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own, saw the world change in ways they could never have imagined as young people starting out on a frontier ranch. But through it all, they had each other. The foundation they had built that night in the blizzard of 1884 proving strong enough to weather any storm. Cody James passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1932 at the age of 70, with Helena holding his hand and surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Helena grieved deeply for her husband, her partner, her best friend, but she did not regret a single moment of their life together. She lived another 8 years, spending her time with family and working on a memoir about their life together that would eventually be published by a small press in Denver. When Helena Rivers James passed away in 1940 at the age of 75, she was laid to rest beside Cody in the small cemetery outside Montrose, under a sky as blue and endless as the one she had come to love during her years on the ranch. Their gravestone was simple but eloquent, bearing both their names and the dates of their lives, with a single line beneath that Thomas had chosen from his mother's memoir. "He broke down the door and opened up my heart." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, Thomas's children and grandchildren continuing the legacy that Cody and Helena had started. And on cold winter nights when snow fell thick and fast, the James family would gather around the fire and tell the story of how it all began, of the cowboy who saved a woman from freezing and found his soulmate in the process, of a love that had defied the odds and built something lasting and true. It was a story of kindness and courage, of second chances and new beginnings, of two souls who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and chose to build a life together that blessed everyone it touched. And though Cody and Helena were gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the ranch and the family they had created, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of a heart that chooses to love even in the darkest and coldest of times. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best, that salvation can come from unexpected places, and that true love, once found, can last not just a lifetime but for generations to come, echoing forward through time as a beacon of hope and possibility for all who come after.